Leviticus chapter 15. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. He said, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when a man has a discharge from his body, that discharge makes him unclean. The rules about his uncleanness are, whether his body allows the discharge to flow or retains it, he is unclean. Any bed the man lies on, and any seat he sits on shall be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed must wash his clothing and take a bath, and will be unclean until evening. Anyone who sits on a seat where the man has sat must wash his clothing and take a bath, and will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches the body of a man so affected must wash his clothing and take a bath, and will be unclean until evening. If the sick man spits on someone who is clean, that person must wash his clothing and take a bath, and will be unclean until evening. Any saddle the sick man travels on will be unclean. All those who touch any object that may be under him will be unclean until evening. Anyone who picks up such an object must wash his clothing and take a bath, and will be unclean until evening. All those whom the sick man touches without washing his hands must wash their clothing and take a bath, and will be unclean until evening. Any clay pot the sick man touches must be broken, and any wooden utensil must be rinsed. When the man suffering from a discharge is cured, he must allow 7 days for his purification. He must wash his clothing and take a bath in running water, and he will be clean. On the 8th day he must take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and come before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest. The priest is to offer a sacrifice for sin with one of them, and with the other a burnt offering. So the priest will perform the rite of atonement before the Lord for the man's discharge. When a man has a seminal discharge, he must bathe his whole body with water, and he shall be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather touched by a seminal discharge must be washed, and it will be unclean until evening. When a man has had intercourse with a woman, both of them must take a bath, and they will be unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge of blood, and blood flows from her genitals, this uncleanness of her monthly periods shall last for 7 days. Anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Any bed she lies on during her impurity will be unclean. Any seat she sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed must wash his clothing and take a bath, and will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches any seat she has sat on must wash his clothing and take a bath, and will be unclean until evening. If there is anything on the bed or the chair on which she sat, anyone who touches it will be unclean until evening. If a man indeed sleeps with a woman who is unclean because of her monthly periods, he shall be unclean for 7 days. Any bed he lies on will be unclean. If a woman has a flow of blood for several days outside her period, or if her period is prolonged during the time this flow lasts, she shall be unclean, as during her monthly periods. Any bed she lies on during the time this flow lasts will be unclean, as during her monthly period. Any seat she sits on will be unclean, as it would be during her monthly periods. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. He must wash his clothing and take a bath, and will be unclean until evening. When she is cured of her flow, she will let 7 days pass. Then she will be clean. On the 8th day she is to take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting. With one of them the priest is to offer a sacrifice for sin, and with the other a burnt offering. This is the way in which the priest will perform the rite of atonement over her before the Lord for the flow that made her unclean. Make the people of Israel aware of every uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle which is among them. Such is the regulation concerning a man with a discharge, anyone made unclean by a seminal discharge, a woman unclean because of her monthly periods, a man or a woman with a discharge, a man who sleeps with an unclean woman.